And we need politics to make sure that those responses are wise, that we handle in an effective way, a successful way, the stresses between winners and losers in the transition, so that nobody feels that this is being done in an inequitable way, and to set the direction for what, by any standards, will be a very dramatic shift in our societies. This is not a minor adjustment in the economy, it's a change in the way we produce and consume electricity, the way we achieve mobility, the way we produce things, and also in the efficiency with which we use things. A low-carbon economy will be a much more resource-efficient economy generally. And I think that, in turn, suggests another key to understanding the essence of this problem. Up to now, we have tended to look at this in a number of dominant dimensions, if you like. A lot of the debate has been an environmental debate. And yes, of course, in a trivial sense, climate change is an environmental challenge, but only in a trivial sense. Actually, it's unlike any other environmental problem that we have ever had to address. For me, as a professional, occasionally lapsed, but professional diplomat nonetheless, it's also a negotiating problem. But again, that's to state the obvious. I don't think that it will be the act of negotiating, the project of negotiating, that will be the cutting edge, the decisive front on which we determine whether we succeed or fail. What's much more important is the political context within which the negotiations are taking place, and the context that determines the mandates that the negotiators bring to the meetings that they attend, whether it's Copenhagen or Cancun or anywhere else. And I think, so what kind of politics is going to be critical for this? It's the politics of growth. We have just been confronted, as a result of the economic and financial crisis, with a set of questions about the foundations for growth that most societies have left unexamined over the last generation. We're all trying to ask much more penetrating questions about where growth, where jobs, where tax revenues, where competitiveness is going to come from in our economies over the next few years. And we can answer those questions in a number of ways, but unless we conclude as a result of that analysis that the kind of growth we want to build is low carbon growth, then we will be, if we don't do that, we will be delivering high carbon growth and trying to address climate change using a set of levers that will continue to have very little impact on the choices that actually will determine the difference. So unless we can construct in all of the major economies a low carbon growth project, we will fail to deal with this. Challenge. I don't want to give the impression that I think the UN climate negotiations are not relevant. After all, this is a session which is supposed to be about those negotiations. And I think, there are feedbacks between what happens in the negotiating chamber and what happens in the real economy. But the point I'm trying to make is that unless you can establish political conditions outside the negotiations which are capable of supporting a successful conclusion of those negotiations, which allow the negotiators to make promises to each other on a sufficient scale, then we will just continue to have an unproductive negotiating process. Look around. Most big negotiating processes go through long periods of relatively low productivity. The trade negotiations, which from many points of view are asking governments to take less of a risk with their economies than they think they're taking in the climate negotiations, the trade negotiations are not exactly a model of rapid economic change driven by a global negotiating process, for example. So we need to attend to that political context. If we do, then we will find that we can agree a legal framework which enables us all to do more than we could otherwise do. And we need that framework. We need a successful negotiating project to establish a sense of common purpose, to enable those of us who are trying to push up ambition in each of our societies to draw strength from the international conversation that's happening. So we're all going to be facing tensions between the forces of high ambition and the forces of low ambition, and a successful negotiation will help the forces of high ambition in our societies. And if we can have a successfully negotiated legal framework, we'll also find that we can mobilize financial transfers, flows of technology that allow us to do this in a more efficient way in a more efficient way than we could otherwise do, and therefore, it will allow us to go further faster. The challenge for the meeting that we're about to go into in Cancun needs to be seen in the light of all of that. You could say that at Copenhagen the bicycle fell over. Copenhagen was not a hugely successful meeting. In my view, it was a fairly major strategic setback in this process and in this project. And I think nobody would be happier if we were to fail to pick the bicycle up and get it moving forward again at Cancun. Nobody would be happier than the forces of low ambition in all of our societies. We need to show that we can make this move forward, but in doing so, we need to be careful not to overreach and not to claim that we can actually get the bicycle to the finishing line at Cancun. I completely agree with Mikhail Gorbachev in his op-ed in the International Herald Tribune today, saying that we need to get a much stronger sense of ambition back into the negotiations. But at the same time, I think we need to be careful how we do that and see this in terms of the underlying foundation that we're trying to build. No treaty is ever stronger than the political foundation that it's built upon. And it's actually the foundation, therefore, that needs to contain the ambition. Just to finish, I want to say a couple of sentences about some of the major players. And by being selective, I don't want to imply that I think the rest of the world doesn't matter. As I've said, this is a problem that affects everybody, in which everybody has a stake and everybody has a voice. I find obnoxious the idea that we should somehow say, as a result of our experience at Copenhagen, that it's too complicated to have a conversation about this among 190 plus countries, because I think any other kind of conversation is one that would lack legitimacy, because this is a problem that affects everybody. And actually it's to miss the point. We didn't have a process failure in Copenhagen, we had a failure of political will. But I just want to home in very briefly on three of the major players. First of all, the one that I come from, the European Union, the world's largest single market, 450 million people. We often underestimate in the EU the extent to which our choices shape the global economy. We lack confidence. We're going through a period in which the politics of anxiety predominate in the EU, which isn't very helpful when you're trying to build a really strong strategic vision for a rapid transformation of the economy. But having said that, I'm reasonably optimistic about the balance of political forces in the EU at the moment. I think there is a strong impulse not just to continue on this journey, but to conclude from Copenhagen that the task for Europe, the primary task, is to actually accelerate our progress from high carbon to low carbon. We're somewhere in the middle. We're actually in the early stages of that journey. Different European economies have advanced different distances on that. But what's very interesting is that there is a pretty strong cross-party consensus in most European countries that actually we need to go, as long as we can find policies which will allocate the risks and burdens in a reasonably equitable way, what we now need to do is to accelerate. All of the main three political parties in my country are in favour of an acceleration, and pretty much the first thing that Prime Minister Cameron said when he took office earlier this year is that he's determined that our new coalition government will be what he called the greenest government ever in British history. He knows that British people, and particularly younger British people, want more of this. They want an acceleration. The US, which has also been a very important part of my life since childhood, actually, I think the situation there is a bit more complicated. There are plenty of positive forces in the US, but there are also some very negative forces. And my worry, if I can speak sort of under the Chatham House rule in this large chamber, my worry is that the issue of climate change has been sucked into a deeper conflict which is playing out in US politics at the moment, almost a cultural conflict between two very different ideas of US national identity. And it's kind of stuck in that conflict. And until that conflict can be resolved or at least eased, it will be very difficult for the US to move forward in the kind of dramatic way that I think all America's friends want to see the US do. I have to say, having said that, that nothing gave me a more positive feeling as a result of the various elections and referendums that took place in the US earlier this week than the resounding vote from the citizens of California against the proposition that the Schwarzenegger climate legislation should be repealed. I think that would have been a disaster in the global politics of climate change if that vote had gone the other way. But actually it went the right way, and the citizens of the world's, I think California is the 10th largest economy in the world, also in a sense have said that they want to make the same choice that Europeans are making, and I take a lot of encouragement from that. It would be presumptuous sitting here with Mr. Sun to say very much about the situation in China. My understanding of China is very superficial. But I think I would say that looking at China from the outside, in many ways the forces of high ambition are stronger in China than they are pretty much anywhere else. And I think that too is a reflection not of climate policy in China, but of a deeper cultural phenomenon. Because I think in China there is the opposite of what we have in Europe and what I think America has as well, which is a mood of anxiety about the future. There is a sense of empowerment about the future, a sense of confidence in which it's easier to think on a big scale, to think about change on a big scale. And I think that's a helpful phenomenon. Somebody said to me recently, who knows China better than I do, China missed out on the Industrial Revolution. It missed out on the IT revolution. Why would you think that China would be willing to miss out on the Green Revolution? And I think that's quite an interesting observation, even if it, I'm sure, greatly oversimplifies the real situation in China. Final point, I've just come from Seoul, as Mark has, and one country where there is a really impressive political project to build a model for low-carbon growth is Korea. I don't think there is any economy which is moving forward more quickly on a wider range of fronts than Korea. Koreans are building a consensus that their destiny lies in being an early mover towards low-carbon growth. It's a work in progress at the moment. But again, given the success that Korea has enjoyed in recent years, given the innate dynamism of the Korean economy, I wouldn't bet against that either. And that by itself is a very good reason for other manufacturing economies to not to stand still. Thanks very much.